Hi there, everyone. Today I just wanted to share some writing tips or writing advice or some of my thoughts on writing or whatever you want to call it. So, um, this is relating to visual novels, of course. If you don't know me, I like making visual novels, and I assume that you guys, uh, at least are somewhat interested in visual novels too. So something that's very common in the visual novel writing space, especially when it comes to romance visual novels, is the from the perspective of one guy, there are multiple love interests that are girls, or from the perspective of one girl, there are multiple love interests who are guys, and at some point around the time when I was writing my first real visual novel, The Silent Column, I started getting um, kind of confused about how to write uh, male protagonists and stuff. And I was like, am I just bad at writing guys? What's going on? And also, I know that sometimes worlds can end up feeling like weirdly empty. So I just thought I would share my thoughts on those two sort of issues. Like, why do your protagonists feel why do you have trouble writing your protagonists? Why do they feel so bland? And why is the world weirdly feeling empty? And just a simple way that's effective that you can just combat that and have your protagonists be more their own characters while at the same time making the world feel more fleshed out. And this is probably pretty obvious, but what I found is that I wasn't having trouble writing guy characters. What I was having trouble with was writing the protagonist, because the protagonists in these sorts of visual novels tend to be like, okay, so there's one protagonist, there's multiple love interests, and they're sort of supposed to be able to kind of work fair enough with anyone. And so that sort of thing is great if you are specifically wanting to write a protagonist who is initially confused and figures out more about his or herself as they fall in love and get to be with someone. But if that's not the case, then what you have here is a protagonist who you're worried about defining in any strict way before they actually start on someone's route. Because they're supposed to be able to fit with any of the love interests, and maybe some of the love interests are very, very different. You know, like, just off the top of my head, thinking about my favorite visual novel, Katawa Shoujo, which, if you have not read it, I know it's pretty old at this point. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But there are 5 love interests, and let's just say Shizune is like completely different from Hanako. It's just true. Hanako is like more of a quiet, dealing with emotional trauma, reclusive type of person. And Shizune is more of a go-getter, go-get-em kind of, let's take on the world by storm, you're gonna do what I say kind of character. And it's like, so obviously, you can imagine, like, if you're writing a visual novel with like some love interests who are radically different in the common route, which is the section that happens before you go on the route of any of the love interests. Of course, how are you supposed to define the main character at all if they're supposed to fit equally well with any of the love interests, right? So, I don't want to beat around the bush. The really, really easy way, and that's not meant as some sort of degrading comment, but the really easy way, it's just really simple to understand, of dealing with this is just, instead of having one love interest, instead of having one protagonist, you just have one protagonist for each of the love interests. I don't play that many visual novels despite making them myself, but from what I remember, this happens in EF, which is a visual novel series that, well, it has how many love interests and how many protagonists does it have? Let's see. There's the main guy with the main girl, and the main girl like kind of looks like a nun, and the main guy kind of looks like a priest or something, and they have like stories where they're helping out other couples. And then there's like a manga author with his love interest, and then there's a girl who like regularly loses her memories and her love interest, and there are quite a few. I don't know how many there are, but my point is, think about this, right? I realize that sometimes people like the idea of the protagonist being a relatively blank slate, so that way people can project more easily onto him or her. And like as the story goes on, they like figure out more who they are and stuff like that, and that's valid. But sometimes it's tricky writing those characters because it's like that might not be the story that you're trying to tell. That doesn't need to be the story you have to tell all the time. It's just refreshing to know that your protagonists can also be interesting characters in their own right, who don't need to be overly flexible to fit with anyone in any given situation. Like, yeah. So, and then at the same time, it's like, well, the world might feel empty if you basically just have the one protagonist and their, like, let's say 4 love interests, right? Maybe you don't really know what else to do, but it's like, if you think about it, if you force yourself to add 3 other characters, one protagonist for each of the remaining 3 love interests, then all of a sudden these characters can like interact more. Like the protagonists can interact with each other, and they're each distinct characters in their own rights, and it just helps the world feel more actually lived in. Like sometimes it feels weirdly empty when it seems like it's literally just the protagonist and like a bunch of love interests, right? But this way it's like, hey, I already have these characters around for these other routes. I might as well have them mingle with each other. And it makes the world feel more full. So yeah, that's the really easy way to do that. And I think it's interesting and effective. And lastly, I just want to say that something that's interesting about this, as someone who makes visual novels myself, sometimes I wonder if you are trying to make a sequel to a game where you have one love interest, where you have one protagonist and multiple love interests, how do you even do that? Do you, because it's inherently indecisive, right? That's not how life goes. The way life goes is that you actually decide on something, and time passes, and, if you flash forward into the future, you're not confused about where that person is because they've been doing their life journey this whole time and it has been defined. But trying to, make a sequel for a traditional, like, multi-love interest, one protagonist visual novel is like, okay, so do I just extend all of the love interests' roots? Because he or she could be with any of the love interests, right? But this way it's like, oh my gosh. It's like each of these are their own individual stories, and you know that these 2 characters are together, and you can just be like, what happens later in these characters' lives, because they're actually defined, And also, this also introduces the possibility of more easily like segmenting these stories, because each of these could be a story in its own right. It would be very different if you were trying to just have one protagonist with multiple love interests. Say you were trying to make a visual novel where one protagonist had four love interests, right? And then you were like, well, I don't have enough time or whatever or resources to make a visual novel that long. So instead, I'm going to release two visual novels where the protagonist can choose between two, right? But that feels sort of weird after a while, because it's like, okay, it's always this protagonist. Like, it doesn't feel as natural. It feels like, in my opinion, it feels like that's meant to be one game that was just broken up into different parts arbitrarily because of like outside reasons. But if you have like unique protagonists for each love interest, you can release those one at a time because each of the stories are unique in their own rights. And you could have these other protagonists make appearances in these other stories, and the world will just feel more fleshed out. So that's the really basic concept that I wanted to tell you guys about, because I think a lot of people are interested in making visual novels, but it doesn't all need to be the, like, in terms of romance visual novels, it doesn't all need to be the one protagonist, multiple love interests. Like, introducing more characters and pairing them together can allow these characters to feel more defined and also can flesh out the world more. Of course, like I said, Katawa Shoujo is my favorite visual novel, and those sorts of visual novels where there's one protagonist and multiple love interests certainly have a place. I'm just giving you guys another alternative to consider, and I think that it is interesting. And I was relieved to find that it's like, oh, I don't have trouble writing guys. I just have trouble writing protagonists in these certain visual novels because they're meant to be undefined for a while, and that trips me up sometimes. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Take care, everyone, and I will see you in the next video. Let me know your thoughts or opinions in the comments, or if you have other writing advice or tips or whatever. Okay, take care, you guys.